La question de la cuisinière, le cuisinier. J'ai posé la même question. C'était, et on m'a donné les réponses. Je vais demander à Gwen, maybe to answer it.
Thank you. The question was why evaluate a cook and perhaps the local person rather than the underground? In fact, the analysis does the both. The member of the public who would be the most exposed was selected to be the cook, and so that was responded to detailed evaluation. And there are in the documentation exposures to workers underground who would be classified as radiation workers.
Could you give me a more precise reference for where that's found? Or maybe afterwards?
It's Ernie Becker. Perhaps I can respond in a little more detail to the question of the safety of the workers in underground uranium mines. There has been already a lot of references to various safety programs that are required. There's the radiation protection program, there's the environmental protection program, also just general occupational safety programs that are required. And these have been in place for many years in Saskatchewan. Nonetheless, there were concerns a number of years ago of whether these programs were really adequate. And at that time, the government of Saskatchewan, and together with the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, commissioned a study to go over this one more time and ascertain whether those particular programs were actually sufficient. It's a long, fairly technical program, which you can certainly obtain from the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. But one of the conclusions from that study was that if you look at the lifetime radiation exposures of underground miners or just general miners in Saskatchewan and compare it to the radiation exposures that they receive in their homes and just generally the natural background levels of radiation that everyone in Canada is exposed to, you find that those those exposures are very comparable. In other words, if you look at total exposures, as I recall, the normal person living in a normal home in Canada receives more radiation exposure than the uranium miner at work. Now, of course, to be fair, the uranium miner also has a life, and so he will receive not only the radiation exposures that everybody else gets, but also he will have additional exposures on the job. But the two are very comparable. And
if they're comparable, then you would be receiving double the dose of radiation, would you not?
Depending, but approximately, yes.
Just perhaps commentary to the CNSC. I spent about a half an hour this morning on the CNSC website trying to find documents about uranium and health, and I reviewed the titles of 200 documents that came up in a search on worker health and couldn't find anything that concrete. So I think that kind of information would be very helpful to people. So my other question is there any current monitoring of the health of Saskatchewan uranium miners in sort of a long-term epidemiological manner?
I want to clarify a little bit what Mr. Becker said, is that epidemiological studies have been conducted on uranium miners actually showed increased incidence of cancer for miners from the earlier years. I want to make sure that that's clear so that people don't misunderstand, and I'm sure that wasn't the intent, but to be clear that if we go far enough back in the earlier mining years, there is an increased incidence in cancer as a result of exposure to radon progeny, long-lived radioactive dust in mines, and epidemiological studies have shown that. And we do have the study. It is available. I'm not sure if you've seen it, but we certainly can make it available to you so you can read that. What's important, though, is in the mines today, the modern mines, the mines that are currently operating, the exposures to which miners are exposed to is substantially less than any of the numbers that were observed in those earlier years. It's important to note that there is a challenge in epidemiological studies when you're trying to study potential effects from very, very low levels of exposure. And the reason why is because we already know that people get cancer, for example. I believe the rate of cancer for Canadians is somewhere in the order of 30% or something like that. So if you're trying to find an incremental increase in cancers as a result of exposure to radiation, when you're into very low levels of radiation, it becomes very, very challenging in trying to really be able to find that distinction. So there are some limitations on epidemiological studies simply because you're into levels that become very, very low. Sometimes people talk about it as you're in the noise range. You're in an area where it's very, very difficult to try to isolate and identify these kind of things.
Final comment then, I think this speaks to what the earlier questioner was raising, is that the information being presented is that there's no risk and that everything will be fine. That's sort of the general conclusion. And I think it lacks a lot of those nuances of uncertainty that hopefully have just been raised. And I'm not here to say that people will get cancer if they work in the uranium mine, if there is ever one here. But to have the proponents and even earlier the CNSC, before this additional clarification was provided, seeming to suggest that everything is fine in Saskatchewan, and you had 4 chiefs from uranium mining communities in Saskatchewan come and tell you that everything is fine, to me is just a little bit misleading. And I appreciate the more nuanced information that's come out following my questions. Thank you very much.
Merci. Je voudrais rappeler aussi que le projet que nous proposons, quand on parle d'impact négligeable sur notre étude d'impact environnemental, on parle du projet d'exploration. On parle d'un projet d'exploration où on va extraire 286 000 tonnes de waste et 750 tonnes de minerais qui vont rester sous terre. On fait seulement 3 accès limités dans une partie du gisement pour aller vérifier la radiation, pour aller vérifier la quantité d'eau et la qualité de l'eau, la méthode de minage et le radon. Ça, c'est de l'information qu'on ne peut pas obtenir de la surface. Il faut aller voir sous terre. Quand on parle que le projet qu'on a présenté dans l'étude d'impact environnemental, c'est négligeable. Lorsqu'on aura cette information-là et on refera une nouvelle étude d'impact environnemental pour une mise en production avec la vraie information, non des hypothèses de travail, comme on a fait présentement, parce qu'il y a une caractéristique du gisement Matoush, c'est que on n'a pas d'eau qui revient. On a fait 170 000 mètres de forage sur la zone et il n'y a pas d'eau qui revient en surface. On ne peut pas prendre l'eau, disons, qui a intersecté la zone. L'eau, elle ne remonte pas, il y a des fractures. Est-ce que c'est pour toutes sortes de raisons géotechniques? Il faut l'expliquer. C'est pour ça qu'ils nous ont mis des critères extrêmes si jamais on rencontrait des grosses masses d'eau, que l'usine de traitement soit capable de le traiter. Quand on dit puis on est challengé, puis des bonnes questions, que vous dites, le promoteur dit qu'il n'y aura pas d'impact ou elle va être négligeable. C'est parce qu'on parle du programme d'exploration. On n'a pas fait d'études d'impact encore sur la mine. Peut-être que l'information qu'on va obtenir, que le gisement a des quantités de radon ou de radiation, à ce moment-là, on va inclure ça dans l'étude d'impact qu'on vous présentera pour la mine, puis on vous dira, bien, l'étude, finalement, la mine, elle ne sera peut-être pas négligeable, il va avoir un impact, puis ça va être ça les conséquences. On n'a pas d'arsenopyrite dans notre stérile comme il y en a en Saskatchewan. On n'a pas de nickel. C'était la quartzite, c'est de 286 000 tonnes. C'est une roche qui est clean, qui est propre. Et on sort 750 tonnes qu'on va garder sous terre, on ne la monte seulement pas en surface. C'est 0,26 %. Mais on applique à partir de la première journée, lorsqu'on commence, les gens qui connaissent la mine, on fait une farce, puis on descend en rame avec une farce pendant 18 mois. On va appliquer les mêmes méthodes au cas où qu'on frappe une zone qui aurait un petit peu de minéralisation dedans, mais qui n'a aucun forage à date qui a identifié. On a fait plein de forages et on n'a pas identifié, mais on a pris des précautions et on nous demande de prendre des précautions comme si on était dans le minerai pur tout le long de ces 24 mois-là. Fait que, oui, l'étude d'impact environnemental qu'on a présentée montre qu'il y a des impacts négligeables parce qu'on ne travaille pratiquement pas dans la radiation. Mais éventuellement, peut-être qu'on aura d'informations que la prochaine va dire oui, il y a d'impact, puis les conséquences, c'est ça.